this is Nick from PRI UK. This is the third podcast that we've recorded or are recording. And this one, it's paranormal and detection. And again, as usual, we are including the caveat that these are our personal views. You know, we respect other people's opinions. The paranormal investigation, it's not an absolute science. We observe, we record, we see, and the rest of it. But anyway, so Andy's here again, and this time we'll talk about paranormal and detection. So Andy, once again, take it away. Tell us about paranormal and detection.
What's that, Nick?
Paranormal and detection.
That's right. Yeah, I'm just demonstrating that.
Your powers of observation.
So basically, that was an example of how our ears interpret air pressure into electrical signals.
Yeah.
That's processed by my brain.
If you got one, yes.
Yep. Into a form that I can understand.
Yes,
so
okay.
ultimately, that is detection.
Right.
So what's interesting about the paranormal and detection is I think, you know, when you read about this and you watch the documentaries, you hear people's stories, there seems to be, you know, some themes come out here, and one of them is animals. You know, animals apparently are more sensitive to detecting so-called entities or spirits.
Okay, so how would you say that? Because you can't talk to an animal. An animal can't talk to you.
Well, you can talk to them, but I mean,
Dr. Dolittle did.
But, well, the one theory is that animals' eyes, perhaps certain animals like cats or dogs, can see further into the ultraviolet or the infrared spectrum than we can. So they may be able to detect a mass that's not quite in our spectrum of range for our sight.
Okay, I mean, that's an interesting thought. But, so, I mean, again, generally people do have this thing about, particularly dogs, you know, our dog, you know, we were sitting there and suddenly, you know, the air temperature dropped and the dog was sitting up and his hackles were raised, and so you think there's some credibility to those sort of stories?
Well, another thing is do animals see in a higher rate of frames per second than humans do? You know, maybe they can. I mean, say for instance, we only. I mean, I don't know how many frames per second we see, but I know movies normally 30 frames per second. I think I could be wrong, but do animals just actually have more information coming into their brain?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, I must admit that the concept of frames per second, I'd never related that to our senses. I just thought it was a constant stream. But again. I can perhaps see that point of view. I mean, at the end of the day, we don't really see with our eyes, we see with our brains. It's only interpreting the signal that comes through the eyes, and it's the same as hearing as well, isn't it? So, I mean, again, detection, I mean, we're looking at it from a positive point of view, but of course that could have a negative impact as well.
Well...
that's a leading question.
Yeah. Well... Give an example of a negative impact.
All right, a negative impact is I think I can hear a sound and I think it's saying my name.
Okay.
And it's because I'm interpreting that. And again, you think of things like EVPs, you know, the electronic voice phenomena, and you see it on these TV programs. It's, oh, did you hear that? In this recording, it's saying, and you go, and they say, it said so and so. And somebody looks at him puzzled and then says, "Oh yes, and of course the suggestion's there. So of course they follow with the.
I mean, there's that phenomenon of paragolia, isn't it?
Yes, that's
so
it.
Basically, we experience the world through our brains. So we look for patterns. Our brain's hardwired for patterns, and it's how we survive as a species. It's how we're still here, actually.
Yeah.
So when you hear a sound, your brain is trying to do the quickest way of figuring out what it is. It'll take shortcuts, and it'll just think, "Oh yeah, that sounds like this. That sounds like that," and then it will tell you what it thinks it's hearing, basically.
So I mean, again, there is very much a sort of a primitive element to that, in the sense that our brains try and make order out of disorder, and so therefore it will create a pattern that we can recognise, whether that's in the form of sight or sound. But
Well, you think about it. I mean, we really don't understand what reality is. All we do,
I don't know what reality is for sure.
absolutely. I mean, all we do is basically have this system called the brain, nervous system. We have the eyes, the ears, the smell, the touch,
Yeah.
and all we're doing is that's just electrical signals going to the brain. I mean, the colour. I mean, when I tell you that that curtain is green, you see a different green to what I see.
Well, you might be, yeah.
By the way, I'm colourblind, so it's probably is bloody red.
It's not a good example,
Yeah,
is it, really? But
yeah. So
yeah.
Well, the other thing is children tend to be more sensitive for paranormal activity than adults. That's a theme that seems to.
It seems to be a theme, doesn't it? I mean, again, there are probably psychological factors. I'm not a psychologist, and everybody says, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about," and they'd probably be dead right. But I always think in terms of children, not necessarily having life's experiences, so therefore everything to them is new. So as far as I'm concerned, they will, and we're hardwired for danger, as an animal. And I sometimes wonder whether this idea, that children are perhaps a little bit more sensitive, they're probably not as worldly wise, and therefore will be more fearful, perhaps, of certain things, and equally this idea of the friend, the imaginary friend. I mean, it's not an uncommon thing, and I don't think that that's necessarily anything to do with the paranormal, although a lot of people say that it is.
Yeah,
Half and half, maybe.
And
I
the
don't
counter argument that what people will argue is, as adults, your belief system is formed. Your brain will block out information you just don't want to hear or see. It's a bit like you get set in your views as you get older.
It's certainly like Britain's Got Talent. That's something that I filter out. It's something that I don't want to hear or believe. But
well, the other thing that is interesting is this thing about, I mentioned in an earlier podcast about seeing a shadow person out of the corner of my eyes.
Yeah.
Again, that's detecting movement in your peripheral vision, and when people say they see shadow people out of the corner of their eyes, there's two arguments to that. Well, there's probably more arguments. I'm just going to mention a couple here. Some will say that the reason why we see shadow people out of the corner of our eyes is because, we, as our eyeball forms, it eventually becomes denser and it can block out light information coming into the brain. But at the edges of your eye, the lens is thinner, and more information can come into your brain via the outside of your eye. So some people will say that's how you can detect spirit or detect shadow people, is because it just happens to be the part of your information retrieving system that's not so dense.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not a doctor. I wouldn't really like to comment, but I've always felt that the reason we have this sort of I saw it out of the corner of my eye is very much part of our defence system, that we catch things in our peripheral vision that we're not quite sure of, and it triggers a fear factor. Yeah. Again, it's just a thought. But
so what's interesting is actually for motion detection, our peripheral vision is best. So when scientists do these experiments about trying to capture motion, they've found that the actual peripheral vision is almost designed to detect motion.
Right.
So as a species, it's obviously, you want to see what's coming your blind side, otherwise you might die.
Yeah. Okay. Well, next time I'm driving the car, I'll look out of the side window rather than through the windscreen, and perhaps I'll it'll be a safe way.
Well, the next time I get in the car view, Nick, I'm not going around the M25 for a shortcut. So I don't care what eye you look out of. I'm not going around it. So the other thing is, when it comes to detection, some people argue that we use equipment that can see into the infrared spectrum, ultraviolet spectrum, thermal heat spectrum. So these are apparent methods of detecting spirit or ghosts. What's your views on that?
Well, again, it's it's an interesting fact that talking to people, they're saying that a lot of these EMF meters, these electromagnetic force meters, are designed purely for the domestic power supply, so therefore they're completely useless in detecting a whole range of electromagnetic forces. And again, I'd go along with that. But having said that, I mean, from a static point of view, they do seem to trigger, but I can't see that has got anything to do with not necessarily to do with the proximity of what people call a ghost.
I mean, I agree. I think, apparently there's a natural normal range of EMF, which is 0.1 to 1.0 milligas. I'm not a scientist, so don't even ask me what that means, but there's a natural range in the background already. And when that starts to flicker, especially these K2 meters are the flashing lights, they're so sensitive to, they're not calibrated. A mobile phone signal will set it off. I would say the only use an EMF meter would be with a tri-field meter for different currents of electric fields is that you can measure just how much EMF is triggered, is coming off equipment in a room.
I think that's the important thing, definitely.
Because there's a link between high EMF fields and its impact on the human brain.
Yes, and I must admit, I've experienced that. I've been in a basement of a building where the power supply came in. It's a fairly large building, and having walked past the meter board, that makes it sound as though it's one of those things that's whirring round and round, but obviously where the switches were for the incoming power and redirected the various parts of the building, and the thing nearly knocked me over, and I can't say for 1 minute that was a spirit or ghost activity. I think it had more to do with the fact that there was a high electromagnetic field around that particular input of power to the building. But again, a rational explanation. Who knows? Perhaps there was a ghost there trying to knock me over. But
well, what's interesting is some people who report poltergeist activity or hauntings, if they get advice about unplugging all the electrical equipment in their house on a night,
yes,
they report that it dies down.
Yes.
So, one could argue it's the electromagnetic field causing the brain to, experience these things. Or one could argue, if it is an entity, they just don't have the power supply to basically do anything.
Yeah.
Who knows? But there seems to be a small correlation between that. The other thing about meters and measuring detection is temperature. There's this thing about cold spots.
Yeah.
What's that about? Like temperature become colder. It's.
Well, I think the trouble is you see people and they're carrying these trigger-held devices. They cost, I don't know, a few quid, tens of pounds, or not even tens of pounds. They're measuring surface temperature, and yet they seem to think that they could be used for measuring air temperature. Complete fallacy. They look quite good. I mean, they look like guns. So I suppose the point is it does actually. But I don't know what they're shooting. But they're shooting themselves in the foot if they think they can rely on that to measure air temperature.
Well, I think that's where the bullshit detector comes in, isn't it, really? I mean, that's another form of detection is bullshit.
Yeah.
And I think if you have a group of people walking around with these laser temperature guns thinking ghost busting, I would... In fact, they're probably more dangerous than whatever's inside your house already, to be honest.
Well, I think the laser probably is, but...
The other thing is barometers.
Yes.
There's a link between air pressure dropping or increasing when a paranormal activity happens. I mean, what's that about?
I don't know. Again, I mean, it's one that people sort of link, doesn't it? I think that air pressure is probably more measurable in some ways than air temperature, but it's the reaction of the equipment and whether it's actually happening at the time was happened some time before, in the sense that you're not measuring it as it's actually happening. You'd have to have some pretty sensitive equipment to do that. So when people are saying, "Oh, the air temperature's dropped or the air pressure's dropped," it hasn't happened at that particular moment in time.
Yeah.
So I think that can be sort of thrown out the window as a reliable source of information. I'm sure there's equipment that you could buy, extremely expensive equipment you could buy, but I don't suppose that's within the range of most people that are doing some ghost hunting.
I think the other problem is that when you're dealing with spontaneous phenomenon, you know, you would have to have equipment set up in exactly the right place. It's going to happen in.
Yes.
And it's just not going to happen like that.
No,
you know,
no.
It's,
But then I suppose the other thing is the EVP, electronic voice phenomena, recording it on a digital recorder. The situation, as far as I was always concerned, was, you know, how does that happen? It's got to be interference. It's got to be something to do with the recorder itself. And I've used equipment just to basically record what's actually happening, and picked up, you know, anomalous voices, disembodied voices, very audible words. Isn't white noise. This is actual words you can hear quite clearly. So I guess the question is, how does that happen? I'm sure, again, that there's probably a rational explanation, but it does make you think. And I think the trouble is, that's it. Once you start thinking too hard about it, you can create all sorts of scenarios and stories to explain why it's happening. And of course, most people say that's because the spirit is talking to you.
well,
Spooky.
the problem is you know, every time you find something of interest, it opens another 3 questions up.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
it's something that is frustrating because it's frustrating because contamination, you know, the equipment that you use, you're always, even people who weren't there will doubt that you were there with that person you said you were.
That's true.
You
Yeah,
know, it's
yes.
you know, it's a bit like people who see Bigfoot. You know, what I mean, they're absolutely convinced they exist, but
Yes.
you know, but because they're the only ones who saw it at the time,
Yeah.
you know, nobody really believes it.
So I suppose actually, sort of trying to sort of sum it up, you know, detection. There's I suppose the evidence from our own senses, and of course that isn't hardwired to anything. So it's down to perception and what people are actually feeling. Again, my personal feelings. But then there is obviously the equipment side, and I think really what we're saying is that there's nothing reliable enough, certainly within the reach of the average ghost hunter, or, you know, the person that's doing this, that can be considered reliable.
Yeah, I mean, I would say to anyone out there who does ghost investigations, is that you recalibrate your equipment every time you go out. Before you go out, you make sure your recorders are lying still on the ground, or you're not holding them in your hand, so you're moving around. You try and triangulate your sounds. You know, put your recording equipment so it can pick up all sides of the room. And one last thing I'd like to mention about detectors is motion detectors of interest, because if a laser beam can be broken, then it means whatever broke that laser beam must have some form of mass for it to go off. So, is that proof that an entity has mass? Well, who knows?
Yeah, an interesting question.
And if anyone's still detecting this podcast, hasn't switched off or got to sleep, do join us for another podcast. Because we will be talking some more.
Yes, rambling some more. So thanks again for listening.
And good night.
Good night.